this into the speech earlier. So 2 weeks ago, I took my first trip to Israel. I've been to different places in the Middle East before, but never to Israel. And it was a bilateral government deal where the Israeli and U.S. government sent 12 people over to Israel to work on energy issues. One of my backgrounds is running Austin Energy, our electric utility here in Austin. And so we visited a lot of Israeli cities, but also visited the occupied West Bank. And I'm not sure how many of you all know this, but after the 1967 war, the state of Israel expanded. Right? I mean, there was a war, and then there was a settlement. A peace accords were signed after 6 days, and wherever the armies were, there were 7 countries involved. Wherever the armies were, they drew a big green line, and that became the new state of Israel. And so what we know as the Gaza Strip ended up becoming what was generally referred to as occupied territory, as did the West Bank, which is the West Bank of the Jordan River. And I'm a relatively reasonably read and attentive and interested American, old Irish Catholic. Knew what I thought a fair amount about the Middle East and about reading the Bible about Israel and all that. But I had this amazing sort of geopolitical awakening 2 weeks ago, spending 8 days in the occupied West Bank. And probably know there's been 30 years worth of peace negotiations going on. Every U.S. president, since at least Carter, but before that, has sort of worked on trying to figure out what is the long-term answer to the Israeli-Palestinian. It's generally characterized as the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There's 2 or 3 million Palestinians, Arabs that live in what is now considered, the larger state of Israel, occupied Israel. The West Bank is under 2 governments. It's a military occupation by Israel, but it's under civilian government by what's called the Palestinian Authority, PA. It actually is the successor of the PLO, which if you're as old as I am, you remember the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Real touchy sort of subject back in the 70s. But the Palestinian Authority which is fully recognized by the state of Israel, part of the Oslo Accords that were signed 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 8 years ago, whatever it was. The Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority is a St. Ed's American. He spent much of his adult life here in Austin. Got his undergraduate degree here from St. Ed's. His name is Saleh Fayez. He got his undergraduate from St. Ed's, his PhD from UT. He's a Palestinian Arab. And he's the Prime Minister running this government within a government. Millions of people in this occupied region. High tension. I mean, we think, A&M UT game on Thanksgiving night, sort of high tension. You go to downtown Jerusalem, and just a half a square mile, you have the most holiest sites imaginable, the most emotional sites imaginable, from both Muslim, Christian, and Jewish citizens there. And tragic, and long history of conflict there. And the guy who's trying to run that civilian government for the West Bank, occupied West Bank, got his undergraduate degree from St. Ed's. And so I could talk to you all at one about leadership, about Austin City Council meetings, and about downtown high-rises. But I saw on the ground 2 weeks ago, what is this remarkable example of probably 60, I guess. He's a generation older than I am. This dedicated, educated, articulate, driven, creative guy right in the middle of what I guess most people consider to be the most politically challenging, personally endangering spot on the planet. He's a St. Ed's grad. So go home tonight or tomorrow and Google Palestinian Authority, PA, put in PAPM, Prime Minister of the PA, and read about a fellow St. Ed's. It's a pretty remarkable story. Sorry, that's a long introduction. Trying to get somebody to come ask a question.
I was going to ask about some of the leadership challenges you encounter, trying to balance there's always been the argument about development versus environment, and how the kind of leadership challenges you encounter, trying to keep both sides relatively happy and keep them in harmony while still growing the city and still making an impact.
Well, there are plenty of challenges. As far as the transition from the Palestinian Authority to Austin, in this scheme of things. So, Austin's politics, the politics that I grew up in Austin as a young professional, young father, trying to raise a family here in town, paying taxes, getting involved, trying to understand who my mayor was, who my city council members were. The issues in Austin weren't Democrat and Republicans. They were environmentalists and business community. Sometimes it's characterized as no growth or growth, and they did this in a really unproductive way for a long time. Much of the 80s and much of the 90s, I think there was really unproductive years in City Hall because it was that dynamic. It is frankly, not unlike what we see in Washington, D.C. today, where there's not a Republican who would even be seen in the same room with a Democrat. There's not a Democrat who would ever vote for, even, vote to consider a bill if it was filed by a Republican, that kind of thing, right? Well, that was Austin for much of the 80s and 90s. And then if it wasn't Democrat or Republican, it was environmentalist, business, it was growth versus, no, we've grown too big already. And just, not coincidentally, I guess, the common ground of that debate, it was sort of ugly and unproductive and messy, was downtown. Because downtown was, frankly, wasn't environmentally friendly, right? It was already paved. There were asphalt surface parking lots everywhere. There wasn't springs. There wasn't endangered species. Downtown was this part of town that should be developed because it has the streets, it has the infrastructure, it has all the concrete. It's all 100% impervious cover, which was the big issue in Austin. And so some of us are saying if you want to stop development, which you really can't do, might as well fight gravity and try to keep people from moving to attractive cities, right? But if you want to promote growth and try to promote tax base and you want more construction jobs, what if you marry the two and downtown is this obvious place where you can do that? And in fact, if we develop downtown, in theory, it'll take pressure off of environmentally sensitive parts of town. And so I found myself in this downtown debate, or really a downtown recognition that it's the geopolitically neutral spot in town. It's where, if Austin's going to grow, and I suggest that try to stop it from growing, you can't. If Austin is going to grow, why not grow where the pavement already is? Why not grow where the roads already are? Why not grow where people can then walk to, shopping and restaurants and live music and outdoor recreation, sporting events and campuses? And so, the challenge, I guess, for me, even after I entered office based on that recognition was trying to remind people that that was the deal, that here's the place where we can have reasonable consensus. Here's, here's why we should want to have, cultural arts facilities improved, built and improved in downtown. Here's why you should want to have residents down there. Here's why we should want to have mass transit. Here's why passenger rail makes sense for a growing urban core of the country, that kind of thing. So, I was able to come in on the coattails of the recognition that if Austin's going to grow, why not try to steer its growth? Why not try to grow where there's going to be least environmental impact, where there might be positive, social elements like, tax base and saving live music venues, or giving them more patrons, or co-promoting cultural arts facilities, that kind of thing. Why not steer growth? But one of the challenges that I had, but I had it less than my predecessors, was just trying to remind people that that's the case. That there is a vision, and it's cloudy at times, and the lines are sort of fuzzy and gray. But here's this relatively large consensus-driven vision of what the city should look like with 500,000 more people. And so let's work to get there. Let's base our investments on that. Let's base our land use decisions on that. Let's help our school district, our universities and colleges, deliver on that. And so really one of the big challenges was just continually reminding people that we've had this argument before, we've come up with this pretty reasonable answer or solution, and let's stay the course and stay with it.
Thank you.
Long answer. Sir.
Not sure if this is on. I don't think it is, but well, it's kind of a multi-part question, and that's kind of a nice segue. Being the mayor of a capital city in a state like Texas, how is it working